Welcome to Strip Coverlet, where we squeeze the bigger picture of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for part 6 or 7 of like a 25-part series or something. I kind of don't care at this point. I even lost the book. Here we go. We are taking on Holly by Stephen King, a couple chapters at a time. And look, I'm gonna start this video off right here. I am going to have, and I know because I tried not to in my note taking and it didn't work, I am going to have something of an accusatory tone during this video. I'm going to be speaking in a manner that is probably going to be off putting, and for that, I apologize. I don't know what to address with this book at this point. So, with a lot of novels, we are in a weird phase of the book, sort of the conclusion of the first third of the novel. A lot of times, those areas in a book start to drag a little bit. It seems that in the writing process, there is hesitancy to move forward, because if you move forward with the story, there's so many things still baking that maybe you won't hit all of them as the writer. And normally, areas of the novel such as this are good for minute detail. They are good for character development. They are good for planting little things that will come back. And maybe some of these things will. I have an opinion on one of them. I think that, what is his name? Uh, Jerome. I believe that Jerome is probably going to hook up with Miss Steinman. I don't know that that is all that much reason to be sitting through this. But we've got 3 sections of this video: a So What Happened portion where we recap what happened in this area of the novel, a Lit Crit where we talk about some of the things that went on, and finally, Writer's Corner. What are the writer's notes that we can take from this portion of the novel? So what happened? Well, we meet Em and Roddy on January 6th, and guess what they're talking about? Bonnie is there too, sort of, and Em is working her over. But when Em is using Peter Steinman's fat to relieve Roddy's arthritis, Roddy says that they should mark her, Bonnie, off of the list because she works for them, and it would be too obvious if they get visited during questioning. Are people going to want to, are detectives going to want to see around their house? We know she worked for you, etc., etc. It would bring people close to their home. Then we cut to Jerome, who had to take Mrs. Steinman, to the hospital and is now maybe questionably, almost sort of possibly staying with her. We don't really know. He says he might, and then he hangs up the phone. I have every reason to believe that that is where he is. If you read the sort of observations that Jerome makes about Mrs. Steinman. And then we have little snippets of Holly just sort of, I don't know, wandering around, kind of. She, and we will get to the revelation at the end of the chapter. So I want to turn to page 117 because there's something worth talking about there. I don't know why I had my book on the floor when I knew I... Okay. We get the couple, Em and Roddy, as they are taking in the events of January 6th, the riot, the insurrection, and I believe this is, Emily said, or no, I guess this is, oh no, this is Emily, yeah. Speaking of Donald Trump, she says, quote, he has turned America's podgy, apathetic middle class into revolutionaries. Intellectually, they disgust her. Now, I am always of the opinion that what a writer puts in a book does not necessarily reflect what the writer actually believes. A writer does not have to believe the things for one of the characters he is employing to believe those things and believe those things wholeheartedly. However, in this case, we have years of Stephen King on Twitter. And when you throw a quote out like that, you know those tell me you're an X without telling me you're an X? This is one of those tell me you consider yourself the culturally and intellectual elite by telling me exactly that you think you are the cultural and intellectual elite. Let's not forget Stephen King is a guy who wrote from the back of a Buick 8. Stephen King is the guy who wrote a script about semis going crazy. Stephen King is the guy who wrote It and that particular scene that took place in the sewers. This is the guy who is all of a sudden the moral and intellectual high ground in the United States of America? Stephen, you write horror novels. Get over yourself. No matter what you think about the people who did whatever on January 6th, whatever you think about people who did not do whatever on January 6th, a quote, which is, I mean, you could have ripped this straight from his Twitter. It's probably one of his tweets. Podgy, apathetic middle class. Stephen, where were you when you got the call that Carrie had been published? What were you doing? Do you remember almost fainting because of the amount of money you were told for which the paperback would sell? You were the podgy and apathetic middle class. In fact, Stephen King had probably a lower class childhood. He was raised by a single mother at a time when not a lot of that was going on. There were not a whole lot of provisions for that thing to go on at that time. And so he writes about it in On Writing. And if I'm remembering correctly, his mother had a job that would have been not just working class, but maybe probably kind of brutal. Several jobs, I think, a series of jobs that were sort of manual labor and would have been rather brutal. So for that guy to then go and use the term podgy, apathetic middle class that are intellectually disgusting. Okay, Stephen. Okay. And then going forward, it doesn't get any more sensical. This is in the chapter with Jerome and Mrs. Steinman. We have Jerome having to take Mrs. Steinman to the hospital, and he's talking to Holly and explaining this on the phone. And this is the quote we get. Jerome calls Holly at 6:15 from outside the Steinman house and tells her of his adventures. He says he had to take Vera to the hospital himself because all of the Kiner ambulances, plus those from the city's emergency services department, were on COVID calls. I'm sorry, what? No, look, I know that there were problems with hospitals having COVID patients. Everyone I know got COVID at one point. I don't know anyone, even people who ended up going to the hospital, who used an ambulance. Maybe I'm the weirdo. I don't work in healthcare, but I work healthcare adjacent. Never heard a story of that. Never heard any of that. Even the stories I know about of people who passed, they did not go to the hospital in an ambulance. It was not a, oh no, I have this thing. I'm having a heart attack. You took a test because you were feeling bad. Symptoms got worse. You went to the hospital. I don't know anyone who went in the back of an ambulance. Am I crazy? Am I missing this? Or is Stephen King, as we have sort of, I have sort of asked a few times now during the course of this novel, is Stephen King basically writing a fantasy novel? This isn't, I mean, this is creative historical fiction. This is, I don't remember the world being this at all. And like I say, I live right down the street from a hospital. I work healthcare adjacent. I know people in that field. This world that Stephen King is preaching on about, I don't think existed, and I think it's because he lives in an ivory tower. So that's that. One more thing here. To close out this chapter, we have Holly, who has taken the call from Jerome, and we have Holly, who has decided to sort of... Einstein did this too. Einstein used to go on walks or play his violin to try to jog his mind. He would concentrate very hard on a problem, and basically you can sort of, with people who have real high-powered brains, you see them sort of winding up their brains, and then they have to do something like that to relieve the tension, and a problem will work out. Holly, not Einstein, apparently uses the same techniques. We get this quote. She gets into bed and looks up into the darkness, wondering what was nagging her at the park. As sleep approaches, ready to take her in, it comes to her. Have there been other disappearances in the vicinity of Deerfield Park? She thinks it might be interesting to find out. No. You think? You think it might be interesting to find out if other people have been abducted in the same vicinity that these two people were disappeared from the face of the earth? No. What makes you think that? A child and a fully grown woman disappear around the same area. Two people who probably interacted, we get from the group of friends that they knew who Bonnie Doll was. You think that maybe other people may have at some point disappeared from this same area? Welcome to Detective Work Lesson 1. Really? This is hitting you 130 pages into this novel. Neat. The only writer's corner observation or note or question that I have for these pair of chapters, and again, not a terribly unusual pair of chapters for this portion of a book, still, I think one would be remiss not to observe the fact, and maybe I'm the weirdo here, very little juice in these two chapters. So, that being the observation, what could have been done so if we are taking this as a writer and trying to dissect it, trying to understand what it means for there to be very little juice in a pair of chapters, what could have been done or done differently in order to inject some juice into these pair of chapters? Well, one thing would be to build tension between Em and Roddy. Emily keeps prodding Roddy because she knows Bonnie Doll is a very attractive girl. Roddy is saying, no, I don't care about any of that. I'm ancient. I don't have interest in that. What if we had some of his inner thoughts and he was interested in that? We would understand that it is possible that in the future there would be some clash between these characters, even if there is no payoff for it. There, in Kurt Vonnegut's, I think it's 8 rules for writing, one of the things he says is always have your characters want something, even if it's only a glass of water. we would understand that Roddy would have those sexual desires and would be interested in Bonnie in that way. We would also be forced to believe that at some point, perhaps other victims had been of that interest. But also, we would be tempted into the look, Emily's not going to put that out there unless on some level she wants to be right. She doesn't want to be wrong, or she wouldn't have put it out there. If she wanted to be wrong, she wouldn't bring it up. So we get there could be some catharsis for Emily, even if her husband, ancient as both of them are, finds himself in some form of sexual attraction with their latest proposed victim. Now, that's that chapter. What about the Jerome and Holly chapter? I think that pair of chapters is more difficult because the juice in that chapter of this pair is limited by the fact that Jerome is with Mrs. Steinman as opposed to Holly herself. Now, this is going to, how dare I say this, right? If I were Stephen King's editor, how dare I say that? How dare I propose? I'm nobody. Stephen King has sold more books than God. I understand, I get it. But if I would have nixed the Jerome stuff or encouraged him to nix the Jerome stuff altogether, put Holly in that situation. Put Holly there with Mrs. Stein. What do we get out of having that with Jerome as opposed to Holly herself? What do we get from Holly being absent during that seizure? What do we get from Holly being absent from the looking into the eyes of a mother who has lost her child, especially in the light of Holly now finding herself a millionaire? Holly finding herself a millionaire, asking herself, why am I doing this? And being forced to look into Mrs. Steinman's eyes gives an immediate sort of emotional payoff, not just for that character, but also we would see the hope of Mrs. Steinman through Holly. We kind of hear about it through Jerome. We're not all that invested in Jerome. I'm not all that invested in Jerome. We just met Jerome. I just met Jerome. I assume Jerome has existed in other Holly stories. Who cares if you're someone who's picking up this book on its own? Other than that, I'm not real sure. One of the things that Stephen King, judging from his last two novels, seems to have gotten lazy about, and again, how dare I say this, I'm a nobody talking about a Stephen King book online. Stephen King has sold more books than God. One of the things that Stephen King seems to have gotten lazy about is sensory stuff. We have here Jerome telling us that he can still taste gin puke from giving Mrs. Steinman mouth to mouth. I believe him. I have no reason not to believe him. But I don't taste it myself. I don't smell that vomit myself. That is what we get from vivid description with a character in whom we are invested. Even I, who kind of hate this novel so far, am invested in Holly. I want Holly to be interesting. In The Art of Fiction, John Gardner calls fiction itself a vivid and continuous dream. That is how the storytelling process is most fruitful for the reader. It becomes a vivid and continuous dream. Surely you have a novel with which this experience is most for you. The vivid and continuous dream happens when your eyes are tracing the words on the page, but you do not register the words. You jump straight from, it's like a sublimation. You jump straight from the word on the page to the idea in the brain. You start to skip the translation through your eyes of the words into ideas, and you go straight from the words on the page to the image. It's a sublimation type thing. And I don't have any of that in this novel. And again, maybe it's just me, maybe it's my reading, but I don't have any of that in this novel. This novel is very sort of cut and paste academic, but not academic like reading Harold Bloom. Not academic like, oh God, sort of the anti-academic that it's academic in Faulkner, right? So unorthodox that you have to use every power of orthodoxy to try to understand it, as with William Faulkner. But this novel so far, and I hate to say it this way because, again, I hate elitism, like Stephen King started this chapter out with. But this novel feels very much like a novel that you would pick up off of the rack at your local grocery store. And hey, that's where they sell a lot of Stephen King novels. But you don't like to think of Stephen King in that way. This feels that way. That's all I have for this episode. I will be back next week with, I believe it's episode 8 next week. I think this is episode 7. So if you like or appreciate what I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, consider hitting the subscribe button, because literature is all I do here. And I hope to have you back for the next one.